Good evening. Welcome to the 6th round of second Indore International Grandmaster Chess Tournament 2024 being held at the IPSA Academy here. And we had a game in the morning as well, and now we have a second game. Let's look at the board positions. So the games have already begun, and on the top board we have Grandmaster Fedorov playing against Grandmaster Hesham, and Fedorov is from Belarus and Hesham is from Egypt. Let's see how the game goes. E4, a standard popular opening. E4, E5, one of the most popular openings these days. The Italian game, as it's called, and C3, standard move, popular for almost 4 decades now, 4 centuries now, and Knight F6, and D3, the modern system. If I had moved the pawn 2 squares instead of 1, the D pawn, then it would have been a old variation, which is a much more complex and attacking variation than today's slow variation. The plan is the same. White wants to play d4 at the right moment, opportune moment, but white wants to castle first and develop the pieces and then eventually go for d4. So black plays d6, bishop g5, a pin, h6, bishop h4. The bishop on h4 can be a liability if black plays g5, and then the bishop on g3 may not have any target. At the same time, bishop on g3 could be very powerful if white is able to play d4, because then the pawn on e5 would be attacked and bishop on g3. So black decides to make a simple move. Black wants to take the bishop to a7 first, strengthen the e5 point, perhaps bishop a7, queen e7, and bishop e6, and g5 only if necessary. So a4, stopping the expansion, which wasn't really the threat, bishop a7. So at the moment players are playing it safe, developing queen e7 as I felt, and then perhaps bishop e6 rather than g5, castles, and now g5. White has made a very committal move, castle on the king side, and now g5. The center is not closed, but it's reasonably closed, and there are excellent chances for black to start an attack here now, and castles was probably a risky move. And after g5, it's clear that however the position could be good or bad either way, because black is in center and black cannot afford to open the center, but surely black has the option of attacking with rash moves. Black could either castle safely on the king side itself or play bishop e6 and try to castle on the queen side, which is little riskier. Another option is to move bishop g4 and bishop h5, something that was played by Anatoly Karpov when he was world champion against Murray Chandler, in where he won a nice game, bishop g4, h3, bishop h5, and Karpov had won this position with black, exact position rather. Another option is to play the risky move h5, but it's a bit weakening and shouldn't be tried. Castles, simple move, b4, and now we're looking at this position. b4 wasn't played by Korchnoi, and I think bishop g4 looks like a logical move, but white is ready to play b5. White wants to drive away the knight from c6 square. When the knight goes away, then perhaps there could be a chance of white forcing d4, and thereafter d4 it would be a good advantage for white. So let's see how the game proceeds, and we'll move to the second board. The first time I think Hesham is really thinking, because here, yes, this was a moment where both the players had played reasonably fast, and here Hesham took a decision. After taking 7 moves, he played g5, and here he thought for a while, because he wanted to take a decision whether to castle on the king side or keep the king in center and launch an attack, or to develop the queen bishop and try to castle on the queen side. And probably he decides against the castling on the queen side, because white opens up b4 and b5 quicker than black can open up the position. The exposed king is always a liability. So after a lot of time, I think, okay, he has taken 3 moves here, but now, yes, after b4 he is taking a lot of time, because b5 is a plan, and for b5 black would probably have to move the knight to square d8, which is possible. I think bishop g4 looks logical, and if b5 then knight to d8 is also possible. So let's go to the next board. At this round we have 5 players leading with 4.5 points, and 8 players on the second spot with 4 points. So we're going to see a lot of fighting games. Everybody wants to get into the lead. On the second board, we have Taibaz of Iran playing against Dipan Chakravarti, the overnight leader. Dipan Chakravarti was leading the field yesterday, but today's game ended in a draw, and then the 5 players the 4 other players who joined him. So knight f3. Taibaz that's from Iran doesn't really go for opening advantage. He plays slow games and tries to get an advantage in the middle game, which is one of the important phases in the game. And Dipan is very well prepared in the opening, so we can see a very good result from the opening for black. A logical move. Dipan plays a simple move. D4 is a more principled move, but so c into d5. Now we've got a reverse Sicilian. This opening, you can say it's like a Sicilian defense. White playing the Sicilian defense and black playing the way white usually does in Sicilian. So standard position, black goes knight to e7. Something different, and also it's a common idea to put knight bc6 and then knight e7 to f5 and then plant a knight at d4, creating some awkwardness in white's position. Bishop d2. This is not a pointless move because the c file is open, so white wants to play rook c1, and after rook c1 there could be pressure along the c file. C file is a semi-open file for white, and D file is the semi-open file for black. So the D3 pawn and C7 pawns will need support of pieces because they could be subject to attack. The D3 pawn is quite safe because white pawn on E2 is guarding it. Similarly, the C7 pawn will have to be moved to C6 eventually, but then where to put the b8 knight? So it's always a complex situation. And although I prefer this position for black, but there are many players who claim that white is an advantage. So chess is a very interesting game where you could have your own opinion, and no, there's nothing like 100% truth in chess because it's after all a sport and lot of permutations and combinations. Rook c1. So both play as per their plan. Black has an option of playing knight d4 directly, or black can play knight f5. Black also has a choice of playing bishop g4, h3 and then bishop e6. White's plan is clear. White wants to play knight e4 and knight c5 and create some pressure at the b7 point. Moving the b7 point would weaken the c6 knight and the c7 pawn. So White's standard plan is to bring a knight to c5. The c3 knight will need 2 moves to go to c5, but that is what the plan is, and let's see how Dipan tackles this. As you can see, Dipan very well prepared. He has taken only 8 minutes, whereas opponent has taken over 40 minutes already. So I think the initial battle seems to be going well for Dipan, and let's see how the game goes ahead. Let's move to the third board, where the Russian participant, Grandmaster Boris Savchenko, is playing against Vianney Dikunna of Mangalore, Karnataka. E4 c5, standard opening, Sicilian defense, one of the most popular openings. G3. Yes, a very interesting choice. This has suddenly become very popular these days. This was first played by Paul Morphy over 170 years back, and now it was then popularized by Bobby Fischer around 50 to 60 years back, and now we have top players playing this. So it's very common for players above 2700 rating play this. D5, a committal move, and generally not considered to be a good move because E into D5 compels you to take with the knight, and you don't have a pawn in the center. The purpose of this variation, which initially started to be played actively in international chess because of efforts of Russian champion Mikhail Chigorin, who felt that after E into D5, knight into D5, white does have some advantage due to the weakening along the G2, C6, G2, H1A diagonal. So let's see pawn into pawn. Yes, the strategic decision, established theory. The what we could say in support of black's play is that black is not really underdeveloped. Black controls center very well, and white has no direct target except c5. So black also finds it comfortable. White wants to open up the center with d4, and black had an option of bishop f6, which black has not played, castles. So I think black is happy with white's d4. d4 has been played, and pawn into pawn, knight into pawn. Looks like a theoretical variation because it would have been a natural move to stop the d4 advance, and knight into knight and rook into knight, bishop f6. White has some pressure in the d line, but black has slight lead in development. Black is going to find it difficult to develop the queen bishop, and it seems that this position is slightly more pleasant for white, because white could play c4 here perhaps, and then eventually bishop could come to f4, c4 yes as played, and knight b6. The c4 pawn is attacked, and the natural move b3 would lose the rook on a1, so white needs to guard this pawn with knight a3, probably better than knight d2, and then white is ready to move the bishop to f4 and the rook to c1, and I prefer white in this position, slightly preferable position for white, but apparently the players have agreed to a draw in this. Quite a confusing result as well, draw without much of the action, because the action which took place was hardly any really active moves played by anybody, and surprising result for sure in a tournament of this nature. But both the players want to play it safe, you can't do it. Draw by agreement is option in chess, so if the both players are respect each other and they prefer to play safe and propose a draw, which is a right of a player. Player is well within the right to propose a draw, and the opponent is well within the right to accept a draw. So we can say the game has ended in a draw. A bit disappointing result for viewers, but that is how the rules of the game are. Let's move to the next board. Here we have Igor Glek. Igor Glek is now playing for Belgium. He is considered to be a great theoretician, and around 2 decades back he had contributed to every opening with e4, every defense, Sicilian defense and French defense. His contributions were immense, and now he is more or less playing the tournaments, not at the same level, just like Boris Savchenko was a better player 2 decades back, and similarly Glek is also probably off his peak. 3 decades back he did really well, but yet he is a very strong player. And let's see, he is playing against the top seed Grandmaster Inyan from Tamil Nadu, and this is a line which was not heard of till almost 3 decades back, but it had become particularly popular after Carlsen started playing it, and it was even played in the World Championship match in 2013, Vishwanathan Anand versus Carlsen. A standard, but standard rated these days queen e3, but a very awkward move when it was played for the first time. People were wondering why this move was played, and bishop b5. So somewhat a strange strategical way of strategical battle, and gives up the knight. So white has weakened black's position, that's all. But yes, what does black do? White wants to play either c4 and knight c3, or just knight c3, develop the queen bishop with b3 and bishop b2, and then play for e5 break in center, after which black would have weak queenside pawns. So indeed a most accurate strategic move. Black wants to play e5 himself, so the white bishop on b2 will be not so active. Why the move bishop g4 was played remains a mystery, though. Bishop could have been better on b7, but then at that time white had not played bishop b5 and bishop into c6. So we can't be talking that if your opponent was going to play bishop b5 and bishop c6, why did you play bishop g4 before? It doesn't happen. So bishop g4 is not a good piece, and knight f6 and bishop e7 and castle looks like a normal course. c4 played by white, knight f6, knight c3, queen c7, and now b3 looks like the most standard move, and white is thinking perhaps. But it's going to be a lot of time. I don't know. Glek is a theoretician and a strategist who forms theory, and here white's strategic plan is to play c5 when black cannot reply d5. So the purpose of move b3 and bishop b2 and perhaps moving the knight to a4. Idea first played by world champion Mikhail Tal was to force a c5 break and then attack the e5 point. Of course, various measures have been taken against this. Black can move the knight to d7 eventually and bishop to e7, bishop e6. So standard opening, and I think white has consumed more time, but white has a pleasant position. Let's see how a strategist and the theory writer plays this. We go to board 5, where we have Nitin playing against Nilas Shah. Nilas Shah plays very enterprising chess, and Nitin has a excellent preparation as well as good strategic base. So we're going to see a interesting battle where one side wants to complicate and other side wants to simplify to an advantage. So I believe that it's going to have it's going to be a resulting game. Queen e2, comparatively less played move, but surely not a move played by himself. There must have been some precedence of this. And bishop f5 and d3. I think black's d into e4 is good if white pawn is on d4, but at the moment the f5 bishop is not able to exert so much of pressure because the d3 pawn neutralizes the bishop, and yet normal position. White could put bishop on c3 and long castle, but the bishop is not stable and it's a standard point g4. Okay, a big committal move and must be opening preparation because white had consumed only 3 minutes and black has consumed 4 minutes. So the idea is to continue with h4 and or just develop bishop to g2, either way, and long castle. So it's, I think, scaring your opponent into castling on the king side and black castles on the queen side. There could be different plans. Black now has to decide the course of the game. h5, logical, and g5. So white has fixed the pawns on the king side. The 4 black pawns are blocked by 3 pawns, and that means white would start activating this queen side pawn structure eventually. So h4, bishop g2, move the knight from g1 to a proper square, h3 and f4, and then perhaps go for a break at g6 or go d4. Bishop on d2 probably is better at d2 here, at the original square here. Knight f3. Okay, he doesn't like to bring the knight on f4. I thought that was the idea, trying to bring the knight to f4. Knight f3. He wants to take the knight to h4. Also a sound idea. I thought h4 and knight on f4 was more in the spirit of the opening because there could be attack against e6 as well. The problem with knight on f4 is black could play bishop on f5 where it would be quite solid, and the other knight would have to attack it from knight g3. Here, knight h4 puts the bishop to awkward position, and white may try to play bishop h3 and f4 and f5. Black is lagging behind in development. White has developed the queen, 3 minor pieces and castle. So 5 piece developing moves. Black has developed only 2 pieces, a bishop and a knight. He has made more than one move of those pieces. The bishop has moved twice, the knight has moved twice. But the resulting position is that white has lead in development and white wants to open up the game quickly. Black is consuming a lot of time. Let's see when, yes, for this move black has taken quite some time, almost 30 moves, because he might have expected knight h3. There comes knight f3, and now, well, a sharp battle starts here, and I think at this position, at this juncture, I must say that white is more comfortable than black because the position looks easier for white to play. Just develop the pieces and try to attack the king in the center. f4, f5 would be a logical plan, and king has to hide somewhere. After developing the pieces, castle on the queen side looks like the option, but where to put the queen? Queen to c7 perhaps, and then long castle quickly. Let's move to the next game. Ashwath is playing against Shyam Nikhil. A very sharp opening, Benko Gambit. Let's see. Benko Gambit was an opening which it became popular. It was found by Benko, American Grandmaster, who came up with the idea of giving up a pawn in order to get active play. The idea is based on the famous Nimzovich Capablanca game, when Capablanca gave up a pawn on the queen side and had two open files for two rooks, the B file and A file, and with the help of those rooks he was able to win the game despite a pawn minus. So the original idea is from the Nimzovich Capablanca game in a different position. That was in a Spanish game. This is a different position. Pawn into pawn and bishop G7, knight C3, castles. Black delays the recapture of the pawn because one doesn't know which is the best capture, bishop into pawn or knight into pawn, depending on where white develops the pieces. Knight F3, knight D7. Knight is heading towards C4 eventually, and thereby putting pressure against B2. In such positions, it will be very risky for white to play B3 because the G7 bishop could really open up against the knight C3 and rook on A1. So black knight could be safe on C4, and black would like to play bishop A6, knight B6, knight C4. White would be doing well by exchanging the knights, and in that case, but it's extremely difficult. I've yet to see a game where white actually defended everything and exchanged the pieces and remained a pawn up. The games have always resulted because of something else and not the extra material. So let's see a very sharp position, knight H4. This idea was first played by Grandmaster Portish, and the idea is just to just the knight shouldn't be in between. White probably wants to play H3 and E4 and F4, bishop D7. So he's going to capture the rook. That means queen C2 and then queen C8, preventing H3 and wanting to take on A6 perhaps with queen. So rook D1, bishop H3. Light colored bishop is one of the most important agendas in this, because once black weakens once black exchanges the light colored bishop, the white pawns on white squares could become weak. White has overextended the position, so as the pieces number of pieces is less, black pieces get more active, and the C4 point and the E4 points become very vulnerable eventually. So rook B1 and bishop into G2, knight into G2. This is what Portish's idea was. Knight would be very well placed on F4, rook into A6, one pawn recovered. The standard play here now is B3, knight F4, and perhaps bishop B2. Black will need to create counterplay in order to justify. Black's move queen H3 looks dangerous, but it's harmless because white will drive away the queen. It seems that black can play queen H3 and then knight to G4 and checkmate white on H2. But as soon as the queen lands at H3, white plays knight F4, so queen has to run away and there's no attack possible then. And if knight G4 is played first, then it makes no sense because queen cannot jump over the knight. So white king is safe, although the bishop is exchanged. We have got a standard position where white has to defend accurately. B3 could be met with C4, and white must play B4, and then queen A8. A complex play is expected here, and white is advised not to weaken this position, but yet what to do then? It's also always a problem. Making use of the extra pawn and to get into endgame one pawn up is not a easy thing to do here. So let's move to the next board. An interesting position where white has an extra pawn, black has some compensation for the pawn. A4 and B3 would be a good structure if black did not have C4, but black would play C4 at right moment and the A4 pawn would fall. So one has to be careful. White knight, perhaps it's good to play knight E3 and knight B3, knight E3 and knight C4, but then you have to worry about queen H3. So the fianchetto bishop is gone, so some weakness on the king's side. Let's see how next game goes. We have here Ilham Parthi, former world champion in under 14 group, and I think also in under 10. So strong player playing against the Vietnam Grandmaster Nguyen. Nguyen is on 4.5. Nguyen is on 4 points, and Ilham Parthi is on 3.5 points. Sicilian defense bishop C4. A very strange move, not very common. The bishop is strong on C4 when it cannot be blocked. So it's more common in e4, e5 openings. Because the bishop on c4 may not have a target if black plays e6, and then black will get d5, and the bishop can't do anything against a pawn that has been supported by another pawn. So it's quite an unusual move here. Black immediately plays e6 and castles a6. Black is going to make life difficult for this bishop, and white is playing more or less with a strategy of bishop going back to f1. So I think it was only a parking square for the bishop, and the bishop never intended to go to b3. So it is just a parking square to help the castling, and the bishop has come back, and now white is ready with the plan of c3 and d4. So logical way of retreating the bishop. d5, pawn into pawn, queen into pawn. Also possible was to take with the pawn, and standard position would have arisen, queen into pawn, b3. So bishop f6 and knight e7 is one plan, knight f6 is one plan, knight f6 chosen, bishop b2, castles, knight c3, attacking the queen, queen goes back, the best square, and black is now ready to play b5, bishop b7, and perhaps plant a knight at d4, knight e5. So it's possible to take on e5, and it's possible to play knight d4 as well, take on e5, and b5, b6, bishop d6, various options, b6, a safeguarding move, c5 pawn is well guarded now, queen f3, attacking the rook, rook would go to b8 followed by bishop b7, rook a7. Okay, rook b8 looked quite normal, but rook a7, black wants to put the rook to d7, the d2 pawn is under attack, bishop d3. So white's plan is now clear. White is probably trying to sacrifice some material, play knight to e4 and destroy black's kingside pieces, and then the bishop on b2 and bishop on d3 coupled with this queen and the e5 rook could really play very dangerous role in this. It would be important to drive away the rook, but bishop d6 there could be a strange move like rook g5 is also possible. So black doesn't know at the moment what to do. Was strange way of attacking. Bishop b7 is a surely awkward move, so one has to play rook d7 first and then bishop b7, but one must see what happens to knight e4. Is there a dangerous attack coming in the move knight e4? We'll move to the next game now, board 8. So here we have Sri Lankan international master De Silva, who recently won the Asian Under-18 Championship at Al Ain UAE just 3 weeks back. Is now trying for his Grandmaster norm. He is playing against Kartavya Anarkat of Gujarat, who is trying for his IM norm. So both of them have their targets. White playing for a Grandmaster norm, black playing for a international master norm. So they are all going to play a fighting game. One quick draw was a bit disappointing, but his other games are quite well fought. This is a Spanish opening or Royal Pace opening. Basically, they are more popular in Spain. The move bishop c4 instead. The bishop c4 here is popular in Italy, so it's called Italian game, and bishop b5 is more popular in Spain, so it's called the Spanish game. f5. Well, an interesting variation which is really more or less not a strategical move, but an attempt to create dangerous initiative by hitting white's center. So quiet move like d3 is possible, but surely not very active, and the logical move that is d4, and for f into e5, f into e4, knight into e5. So d4 played, e into d4, e5. This position I think is quite a old variation. White does get some initiative because black has weakened the king side, but yet it's not an unplayable opening because black gets better space, and at the moment white has not recovered the pawn. So the most dangerous attacking piece, the bishop on b3, will be exchanged, and although white has different moves here, bishop g5, knight into d4, knight into d4 looks more logical than exchanging some pieces. So can black win a piece with c5 and c4? Interesting question. Black plays c5 and knight moves, and black plays here c4, trapping the bishop. So c5 played, certainly the knight cannot move, so black has to, white has to take bishop into g8. If white doesn't take bishop into g8, white loses a piece because the c4 move will trap the bishop. So bishop into g8, c into d4. It's also possible to take with the rook, but then white could take the pawn on f5, and loss of pawn could not be justified. So c into d4. It's clear that black knows all these moves because black has taken hardly 1 minute and white has already taken 37 minutes. So, well, white doesn't know the position, white plays logically. I'm sure that since it has been chosen by black and black knows the moves, in spite of irregular moves, this position seems to be fine for black considering the time, and black is now ready to play bishop c5 followed by take on b3 and castle, knight into b3 first, and queen b6. So again, unusual moves because this is a special opening. Black has violated several positional norms for initiative. Black has weak pawns, and black king is still in center. White has castled, but white has not completed the development. Black's bishop on b7 is very dangerous, and black wants to play bishop c5 followed by queen c6. The g2 point could really become weak. Knight d2, an idea of shielding the b7 bishop with knight on f3. So queen g6, a direct checkmate as early as on move 13, and white seems to be forced to play knight f3 here, but then queen g4 is annoying, and h3, bishop into f3. We could have a complex position. If you don't play knight f3, then you have to play the move g3, and then black could play queen c6, and you have further weakening move f3, and then black goes d3, and the king suddenly gets opened up. It's going to be a very complex game considering that the speed of black's moves. White has consumed more than 1 hour 10 minutes, and black has taken hardly 5 minutes, which means white could be playing against a competitor. It could be a prepared variation where black has taken help of a competitor before the game. Taking help during the game is not permitted. It's illegal and unethical and punishable. But yes, expecting opening from the opponent and preparing it at home is a very common way of doing it, and the speed at which black is playing and white is able to see the threads. But certainly when human wits can't match that of a chess playing computer now, and there are hundreds of chess playing programs which play better than any human being. So it's going to be a very difficult position for white to take decisions, whereas black is going to take very simple decisions, the moves that were recommended by his computer. We go to the next game where we have Ratnakaran getting a second white. Ratnakaran had blundered in the morning game and he allowed a checkmate with white pieces. Now he gets a double white, and he is playing against Ritviz Parab of Goa, Sicilian defense. Naidorf variation, one of the most popular lines. Bishop e2, Openesky variation, popularized by Boleslavsky and other players, e5. This is a response of Boleslavsky to Openesky's bishop e2. There's a lot of contribution from the players from Soviet Union after the First World War, and there's a lot of modern chess theory was basically written by them, found by them, various ideas, and they were able to dominate the chess world for several decades because of this knowledge which the other countries didn't have. So bishop e7, standard move, g4. This is a modern touch to it. The more standard move here is perhaps short castle, g4 immediately trying to drive away the knight, and apparently white is changing the plan. White is going to play probably f4 here and then castle on the queen side, or even bishop e3 here and then castle on the queen side rather than castling on the king side. This position has been played by many world champions. Anatoly Karpov was the real master of it, and Garry Kasparov. They played castles, and Vishwanathan Anand, and they played many good games at this. And here we have a modern move which has probably come in limelight only after the Indians have recommended this move. Chess player Indians recommend strange moves which are not easy for human mind to understand, and by studying with Indian and then understanding, it's a good way of playing. But if you just follow the Indian moves, it doesn't work. But g4, a strong move, interesting move, not a strong move for sure. I don't know about this move. And h6, black's knight doesn't want to get driven away. So bishop e3 and bishop e6. So white will need to do something about the g4 pawn. So rook g1 and queen d2 and castle and h4 looks like a plan. But black is ready to play b5 and b4, trying to win the e4 pawn. Black's plan is clear. Black wants to play b5, b4 and try to win the e4 pawn. White wants to castle first on the queen side and then go rook g1 and h4 or g5. It's also possible to play rook g1 here itself, but one has to be prepared for b5 and b4. Knight d5 straight. So here the e4 pawn cannot be taken because white goes bishop b6 and black loses a rook. Knight into e4 is a blunder here because bishop b6 and then queen moves and knight c7 check. The king must move and then the a8 rook is lost. So white simplifies too early without weakening of black's position. It would have interesting to wait for black to play b5 and b4, but perhaps this is also a valid idea. Knight d7, taking on d5 was probably possible. Now taking on d5 with knight is no longer possible because the bishop would be trapped. But at this stage, knight into d5, bishop into d5, both moves look possible, and so is knight bd7, a standard move. f3, the pawn was now attacked because the threat of bishop b6 has been avoided. So while black wants to take the pawn now, white plays f3, and now black wants to attack white's center. Interesting move. Black is no longer afraid of g5 because then black would play knight into d5, pawn into d5, and the bishop could go to h3 or to f5. So now g5 is not to be feared, and here comes knight into e7 first, queen into e7 and g5. So knight goes to h7 and white has the option of h4 and queen d2. I prefer queen d2 here, and rook c8 in order to prevent c4. If white can expand on the queen side, although white has castled, knight on b3 is a bit awkward, so castles, king b1, queen b4, knight a5 is possible to try. Also, eventually f4 is a possibility, castles and king b1, knight c5. Okay, so taking on c5 is possible, and pawn into c5, queen c3, there could be some edge. I think taking on c5 is more logical than playing king b1, but king b1 can't be ruled out as well. So a major decision, whenever there is a change of pawn structure, when a player can change the pawn structure, then players to think what pawn structure is better for me, the existing one or a new pawn structure where black pawn comes to c5. One of the important ways of looking at it. And second, of course, is my piece more useful than opponents? In that case, one also avoids the piece action. Here it can't be avoided for sure. So king, knight c5, king b1 played, knight into b3 and a into b3. Okay, because the rook is not on a8, he plays a into b3. In similar position, Fischer has played c into b3. But it depends on how the white piece, how the black pieces are. If black gets d5, black would be better there. Here it's possible to prevent d5 break after castles and rook d8. So black is going to play for a d5 break. White is chosen not to take on c5 because the d6 pawn will constantly need support, and black will have to make a plan. Black wants to put knight g6, after which white may not have a plan, so white opens up the bishop, and it seems that the d6 pawn is now into serious trouble. f5 was a threat, and if pawn into pawn, then bishop into pawn, the d6 pawn can't be guarded. So And now really bishop f3 and f5 comes into consideration. Quite a interesting position from white's perspective. Difficult for black to play this position. It's also possible to play bishop d3 planning f5, also rook h f1 planning f5, and it's an important option. I think the rook on g1 has done its duty, and it's a good move to play rook g1 to f1, where black has to either allow f5 and the bishop will be completely dominated, or black has to take pawn into f4, which is disastrous because the d6 pawn can't be served. Black idea is clear. Black wants to play knight d7, then take pawn into f4, and then plant a knight on e5. But black needs one move, knight d7, where the bishop on e6 is well guarded. So rook f1 becomes an interesting move here, and then black could make the things complex with bishop h3, confusing, and then knight d7. But yes, bishop on h3, a piece in enemy territory can always become weak. So rook h1 looks like a most natural move here to me. I'm presuming that f5 sacrifice doesn't work here. Bishop f3 also threatens f5, and black needs immediate solution to bishop f3. I prefer white here for bishop f3 or rook f1. There's no good move. Bishop f3 really plans to play f5, and black is completely dominated. And then white could come back with the bishop e2 and bishop c4. So a preferable position for Ratnakaran, and Ratnakaran is a great master of attack. You can see Ratnakaran has hardly taken 15 minutes and Hrithived has taken 1 hour. So surely something uncomfortable in his mind, and I believe that white has a huge advantage here. Let's move to the boot 10. Prakhar Bajaj, the local star, the local challenge, who suffered his first loss in the morning and been doing very well in the morning. He was beaten, but he's still in the top tables, and he's playing against Ameya Odi. So Ameya from Goa, a very strong player, international master, and looking for Grandmaster norms. This tournament provides Grandmaster norms and international master norms because this tournament has 131 participants, out of which more than 50% have international degree, international title. And there are as many as 10 Grandmasters playing here, 2 women Grandmasters, this is a parallel title for women, and 25 international masters. And the minimum rating to qualify to play into this tournament is 2000, which is quite high, which means that everybody who plays well has a chance to play norm. In norm, first you need a strong opposition, and secondly you need to do well against strong opposition. If you don't play strong opposition, scoring all points also doesn't earn a norm. So one has to be very careful in choosing tournaments which one is playing for norm, and this is a tournament which provides this possibility of making a norm, facility to make a norm if one plays well. The Sicilian defense, and Prakhar plays Rosulumo attack, knight bd7 by Odi. This is the best move to play if black is playing for a win. If black was happy with a draw, bishop d7 is a simple line which leads to roughly equal position. a6 and bishop goes to d3. This move looks awkward, but the pawn on e4 needs support, and the bishop is not going to be a bad piece. White wants to play c3, bishop c2 and d4, after which the bishop on c2 really becomes a productive and powerful piece. Knight f6, rook e1, e6, and now c3 and b5 and bishop c2 and bishop b7, and now d4 is a possibility. And if white is not prepared for d4, white may have to play d3, but after that white can't hope for an advantage. So d4 looks logical, and black would probably capture, and black has slight disadvantage in the center. White has 2 center pawns, so it will be more logical for black to play d5 here, and for e5 plant a knight on e4, bishop e7. So black is not worried about white's immediate opening of the pieces. Knight f8. Well, too early, postponing the castling. a bit confusing, this one for sure. I think castles, she had some problem with short castle, so knight f8, knight c3, knight g6, bishop on g3 is one way, but bishop could be better on e3 here, bishop to d2. It is possible to play bishop e3, and if knight g4 then bishop d2, because bishop d2 straight, and now a3. The knight on c3 is very important because it's guarding the e4 pawn, and white wants to play e5 or d5 at appropriate moment, and before white plays rook c1 and bishop b1, white wants to safeguard the c3 knight. So next plan could be rook c1, bishop b1, and then white decides what to do with the d2 bishop. Rook c8, rook c1, h6, bishop b1, logical, king h8, and h4. White wants to win a piece if white gets h5. At the moment h5 has been prevented because the knight is stopping, but yes, it's a possibility that restricts black's knight on f6, and there could be threats of e5 followed by h5. Rook c7. So e5, bishop into f3 would be a problem, and pawn into f3 and pawn into e5, pawn into e5. Well, e5 still remains a possibility, but bishop into f3 probably is awkward to mate. So, well, here players are thinking now, because this is a time where one has to analyze the position starting with e5. It's not enough to say e5, knight moves, and h5, I trap the knight, because the e5, the f3 knight could get into danger, knight on g6 would get a square on h4, which is not very productive, white's pieces get weak. But yes, e5 is the move one needs to analyze here, and if the analysis is satisfactory, then white should go ahead with e5. Let's see rook c7. Ameya has played rook c7, so surely Ameya knows. Perhaps e5, de, fe, the de, de and bishop into f3, and the d2 bishop is hanging. So if I take g into f3, then black has a crushing attack, so knight h5. So e5 is not possible, and that's the reason white is now planning the play. Let's move to the next board now. Board 11, we have 15 live games here, 15 games that can be seen live on the DG board. So here, Saurabh Anand, former national under-9 champion and under-19 champion, playing against Ayush Sharma, Queen's Gambit. Not Queen's Gambit, he probably wanted to play Nimzo Indian defense, so he plays Queen's Indian defense. This opening is known as Queen Indian defense, as we saw in the earlier streams. If this move has been played by d4 against d5, it's called Queen's Pawn opening or Queen's Gambit. If white plays c4 and if black plays knight f6, it's called Indian defense. But which Indian defense we don't know. Now black has various options here to play Old Indian defense by moving the pawn to d6, by playing King's Indian defense or Grunfeld Indian defense by playing g6, and to plan for Nimzo Indian defense, Queen's Indian defense and Bogol-Jobo Indian defense by e6. So e6 has been played, knight f3, b6. Here we have Queen's Indian defense and g3, the most logical plan. Bishop a6, a move which was, I think even today, bishop b7 is the main move, but bishop a6 has become quite popular these days. And if white develops the knight to d2, then black goes back to bishop to b7, which means that white knight is not at a base square. b3 played, so the knight wants to come to c3 eventually. Bishop b4 check, a irritating move. Bishop and d2 is not well placed, so white goes back and black goes back, and white plays knight c3. Black wants to play e4 here, and there's no point in keeping the bishop on a6 unless you want to play d5. So there could be two plans here. One is just bishop b7, and then the bishop a6 move has been lost for no reason, and the other plan is to play for d5 and making the bishop on a6 active. Surely for d5, c into d5, black wants to take with the c pawn and not take a backward pawn on the c line. So c6 and d5 as chosen is one of the major plans here, e4, d5. Bishop d3, pawn into e4. Yep, pawn into c4 also is idea, but at this moment black's pieces are not well placed for that. So common standard position white's bishop d3 move is very important. White wanted to develop the bishop on j2, but considering the changes and the pressure against c4, white plays bishop d3, a very accurate move, and pawn into pawn, knight into pawn. Had the pawn been on g3, g2, white would have had some advantage. White's plan is clear: castles, bishop c3, queen a2, and eventual knight e5 with dangerous attack. So queen a2 played, castles, either bishop c3 or short castle, long castle. Now that's a thing which changes all the strategic options. White is confident that white's attack will be stronger because the bishop on a6 prevents black's natural advance a5, a4, b5, a5 possible moves for black. A gambit with b5 very much possible. And let's see how the game goes. Bishop b7 and g4. Wants to drive away the knight, c5. So the driven away knight will take on e4. So bishop c3, opening up, and queen runs away from the d file because white rook is in d file, and the in between pieces, when they are moved, suddenly the white rook attacks the queen. So queen runs away, and black tries to play in a normal way, but the g5 move, the availability of g5 move could really create serious weakness against g7 point, because the normal way of guarding g7 is to put bishop on f6, and now this pawn on g4 makes it quite difficult. White is not in a hurry to save the pawn or take queen f4, so black attacks the knight and rook e1. Now a strange decision, because after the multiple exchange I don't see any chance of a kingside attack, and it's going to be more or less a strategic position. So standard exchange takes place, knight f6, the g4 pawn is attacked, and now has white lost a pawn without much compensation? It doesn't seem like that. Rook e2 is possible, knight into g4 doesn't work because of pawn into c5, and rook g1, and the g7 pawn is lost. So rook e2 looks like a standard move, and but yes, white has played a nice plan of g4, but then exchanging the pieces is exactly contrary to the plan, and somewhere there has not been a connection between the previous moves and this attack. I think black has no problems. Only consolation for white is that rook e2, for rook e2 black cannot play knight into g4 because of pawn into c5 followed by rook g1, and black has some problems. Let's see exact variation: rook e2, knight into g4, rook g1, knight f6, pawn into c5, pawn into c5. Yeah, I think black can play that. It's not all that dangerous. And rook f4 leads to bishop d6 and knight e5, or rook f4 leads to direct g5, trapping the rook, but knight into g5. So all these options remain. The possibility of g5 is prevented by knight on f3. Possibility of bd6 trapping the rook, prevented by knight f3 again. After bd6, white can play knight e5. Then g5 is not available. So white is hanging on to the position even after rook f4, but a very awkward position, and white is already in an awkward position. Rook e2, I think black can just take on g4 probably. And there's a possibility of d5 coming then, but bishop f6. I don't see real logic in white's play. If there's no time, if black is not in a bad position, if black is going to exchange queens, then probably g4 doesn't make sense. Here bishop c3, knight e5 could have been tried, g4, black gets c5 and bishop c3. Here, yeah, knight e5 was a desirable move, but perhaps it's not possible. Knight into f6 check was a possibility as well, but queen f4 check is quite irritating, and king b1, black just penetrates queen f4. Here it looks difficult. If white plays knight into f6 check, then the f3 knight becomes weak. So now it's really awkward, and white has not really analyzed the position before playing up. Sharp move d5 is possible. It's a pawn sacrifice, and the consequences of this move have to be analyzed. I don't see much compensation in that move d5, but pawn takes pawn, and we could try to drive away the queen with bishop d2. Then I don't see realistic attack coming though. So a decision rook h1 was, I think, a decision which gives black a very comfortable game, and I think white is not doing well here, and the draw could be a best result perhaps. Let's move to board 12, where Nitin Babu is playing against Sahil Dey from Calcutta. Sahil Dey, a very strong youngster, and Nitin Babu, I've not studied his games, but certainly the point position suggests that he's in a good position. Here, of course, I prefer black. Black is threatening to play d4 here, and white must take on d5. And after the preliminary exchanges, it is black who is more comfortable because of the weak b2 pawn. Queen and rook ending could be a draw, but black would give some threats, and black has a comfortable game here. Let's go back and see the opening part of it. Yet another Rossolimo, and black playing for win. a4 variation, knight c3, a6, bishop e2. So flexibility of Rossolimo. In some lines you could go bishop d3. If you are not developed knight on c3, then you go c3 and bishop c2. In some lines you could take bishop into d7. In some lines you could retreat bishop e2 followed by castle and then d4. The a5, fixing the pawns on the queen side, castles, and b5. So black has first weakness in the position. Black has a weak pawn on a6. Black wants to counter attack immediately. This move is better than capturing on b6 immediately, because if white has to play d3, then the bishop on e2 is no longer active. So black's weakness on a5 doesn't really matter. Knight a4. White wants to exchange a few pieces, castles, knight d2. White wants to save the pawn with knight c4, so black takes the pawn, knight e2. White brought the pieces to the queen side. Apparently, the intention to play drawish variation seems obvious. e5 was a threat, so black goes knight d7 and queen d2, forcing the pawn to move, and the pawn is safer on a4, and black is not worried about this. The pawn is not likely to be attacked, and if attacked, it can be supported with bishop on c6. So black has a more concrete plan of attacking the b2 pawn compared to white. A good move, bishop h6, because the bishop was very strong and has been exchanged, and e6. White is planning f4 and rook f3 and rook h3, so black is worried. e6, queen f4 attacking the pawn, e5, and now queen g3, knight coming to b6, knight goes to e3. Sometimes it's possible to play for a tempo. It was logical also to play knight into b6 followed by f4, giving up the b2 pawn. But with the bishop on e2, one doesn't know how strong the attack will be. Knight into b6, queen into b6, f4, there could be queen into b2, and then f5. It's a complex variant. Queen into b2 is possible because rook b1 doesn't win a piece. Queen into c2, or rook fb1 makes it possible. Then, yeah, knight into b6 and f4 certainly would have won a tempo compared to what is being played, because black gets d5 anyway. And I think black is more comfortable here, but a draw a more likely result because of the reduced number of minor pieces. And the endgames with rooks alone are very drawish, and it's not difficult to draw this. So let's have a look at the board 13, 14 and 15. Grandmaster Zumaev Marat of Uzbekistan has been coming to India for last 20 years now. He's a regular participant in all Indian Grandmaster tournaments. So knight f3, knight f6. Zumaev always believes in simple but sharp play. He doesn't want to go it into the opening positions, well-known opening positions. Matta Vinay Kumar of Union Bank of India is a good player, very good, well prepared in opening. And let's see a Grandmaster playing against untitled player, Grandmaster playing for prize money, untitled player playing for International Master norm. So it's going to be a good battle. Technically accurate knowledge Vinay Kumar has, and Marat has a great sense of initiative. The game has transposed into a proper King's Indian defense fianchetto variation. a variation which was never tried by Kasparov or Fischer, but a variation which is now recently quite popular. And black, instead of developing the knight to d7, black develops the knight at c6, provoking d5, which is not a good move. Black wants to quickly play rook b8 and b5 and start the attack on the wing, and d5, knight goes to a5. It seems that it's a blunder because white can just protect the c4 pawn and then trap the knight with b4, but it's not so easy because black plays c5 and it's never so easy to get b4. So b3 has to be played. Knight h5 was not very useful because white could just move back bishop to d2. So c5, pawn into pawn, simplifies the position for black because a bad knight on a5 now can come to back to c6. So not a very great strategic idea to play d into c6, very uncommon at least. But yes, white still has a possibility of Maroczy bind. Bishop on f4 but doesn't make sense, but other pieces do, and white may eventually put knight d5. Yes, he has done it immediately, trying to play in the queen side e5. Okay, very committal move, which leads to a very weak pawn on d6, and I'm looking for a justification to this. Knight into f6 check is the option, and just bishop e3 is the option. Knight into f6 check, queen into f6, and bishop e3. The d pawn is weak. Black must move the queen and try f5 quickly. Knight d4. Okay, black is willing to accept a weak pawn. That's one of the reasons why it was possible for white to delay knight into f6 and play direct bishop e3, but it was not easy to play knight d4. But then black would play knight g4 and then f5 and a different type of attack. So knight f6 is good, and bishop knight d4. Black takes fundamental weaknesses, so he will have very weak pawns, but there could be dangerous counterplay against e2 point. I don't really believe in absolute soundness of black's play, and I feel that somewhere black is overstepping the position limits, and white should be better here. But white has very less time, and black wants to attack with f5 and f4. White could play knight c3 and put a knight on d5. Knight c3, bishop into bishop, king into bishop, and then black could open up the game with b5, and white puts a knight on d5. White is fundamentally better, but surely black is playing for attack. So when there's a game with initiative, the side with initiative has an psychological advantage, and it often works because when you have initiative, and even if your position is bad, you often end up winning the game. That's what I've seen, and we have a game where black has not completely equalized. Black has taken some risky decisions and white is short of time. Let's move to board 13. Here Mritika Malik, who won the National Junior Girls Championship a couple of weeks before, is playing against Kashish Jain. So let's look at the position. Again a Sicilian, again a Rossolimo, and here a different option. So bishop goes back, and eventually see similar position could come, white playing d4. So you can see that it has come by a transposition, but the same position has come which was there in the earlier game. Black offers the b5 pawn. It cannot be taken because the e4 pawn would be weak. Queen b6. Black has already expanded on the queen side, which means that black doesn't need to really counter the center, but center control is important. White may eventually try for knight f1 and knight g3 and then e5. When all white pieces, bishop on c2, knight on g3 could go to h5, and a strong attack can be tried, and black has to counter attack quickly. Bishop d3, knight a5. Black wants to, white has decided to play on the king side, so what is the point in keeping the queen side open? A logical move. She wants to play knight f1 and knight g3 and attack on the king side. So why give black an option of pawn into a4 and counter attack on the queen side? A logical move. Queen goes back, knight f1, rook c7, knight g3, rook c8. So is white ready for e5 here? And if not, then how does white prepare? Bishop to e3 perhaps, which would threaten d5. Bishop e3 is a possibility, but it's also one more threat of d5. Black could actually play d5 himself. So she has to now decide on the course to play. Nothing urgent, nothing forced. Move the bishop. Not move the bishop is also fine because it's well guarded, but she moved the bishop, a developing move. Bishop to d2 and knight d7. So bishop c3 could be a good wall here. Rook a d1. Okay, so let's see what she has on mind. Bishop c3 would be met with knight g6. Yeah, so there are some weak points in white's position too, and bishop b1 pulled out the bishop to a good square. White has a slight traffic jam, although white has a space advantage. Knight on f3, knight on g3. They need to be moved, road to be cleared, and then the pawns could advance. Queen e8. Does it encourage white to play knight g5 and then perhaps move the queen to h5? Knight g5 looks like a possibility. Knight g5 was not possible because queen was on d8, but now knight g5 looks like a option, trying to provoke h6, which could weaken the black's position. Knight h5 is also awkward move to meet. Knight h5 of course has to be met with knight f6 immediately. The knight can't be allowed to remain there for long, and then white has different options, but taking on e5, taking on f6 becomes necessary. I think knight g5 is a very interesting move. If black plays h6, black has to think twice before playing. Perhaps that's the reason why the queen on e8 could be useful, yet queen d3. Okay, so white wants to play e5 followed by h4 probably, or h4 first, or white wants to just increase the pressure. But where to put the pieces? Knight on h5 is a good square as long as black is not able to challenge knight on. Black's pieces are not very well placed. Knight on d7 doesn't threaten anything. Knight f8 is possible, but queen e8 really a move which I'm unable to grasp, and it was more logical for white to try to push the f pawn as well, but knight on f3 is in between. Knight g5 was a possibility. Queen d3 is a possibility. White stands better. Let's go to the 15th board. PV Nandita, woman grandmaster, member of Indian team in the Olympiad, is playing the white side. A strong attacking player, was playing on the top boards, was leading yesterday, a joint leader in second position. Because of the loss in the morning, she is on the 15th board. e5, the sharpest variation. S. Dhananjay from Raipur, Chhattisgarh, a solid player, is rating above 2200 for many years, is now aspiring to make some international master norms and title. c5, pawn into c5, well analyzed variation. a3, e6, and knight f3, bishop into c5, b4, bishop b6. This pawn structure was first played by William Stiglitz and was subsequently played by Dr. Sigbert Tarash, two greatest contributors to opening theory and the strategy of opposition rather than opening theory. So pawn on e5 has been well guarded. White wants to put the bishop on d3, castle quickly, and then now you see bishop on b2 makes it a bit tough for white because knight f4 is a threat. Castles. Okay, knight f4 has been permitted. I would have preferred to play something like queen d2, but then what to do with the knight on b1, and g3 was a bit weakening. Black also doesn't play knight f4, so rook e1. I'm not comfortable giving up this bishop, but it's possible to play as well. Knight d2, knight b3, and knight d4 is a plan. c4. Aggressive move. So for knight f4, yes, knight f4 made sense when the rook was on f1. Now after rook e1, knight f4 doesn't really make sense because bishop could go to f1 and white wants to open up the position. black is cramped, and in cramped position, if you don't have many pieces to move about, then it would be really dangerous for the pieces, because pieces could come into attack. Knight c5, a counter-attacking move. Bishop goes back to f1, and black plays a4. So c into d5 followed by knight c4 looks like a possibility if black took with the queen. Rook d1, rook c8, queen b1. So white wants to take pawn into d5, but black is, after e into d5, the knight on d2 still doesn't have a square. Then if white had a square for the knight on d2, black d5 would have been very weak, with no immediate plan. Bishop a5, making it awkward for the knight to move. Rook e3, queen e7. And despite space disadvantage, black has successfully managed to develop the pieces, and the position seems to be reasonably all right. d4, interesting move, not a pawn sacrifice, because he gets the e5 pawn, and yes, a nice move. I admire this move, and because the rook is trapped, knight into d4 is forced, and black takes on e5, and black has a more flexible pawn structure. And apparently this move has come as a surprise, because Indra has taken 18 minutes for this, although it's practically a forced move. But yes, rook c3 to c1 is a possibility, with the idea of eventually winning the pawn. So it's a possibility that safeguard the rook with rook c1, exchange the knights eventually with knight e4, and then win the d4 pawn. The d7 bishop remains a dummy piece. So a possibility, but certainly unexpected move and an interesting move. So okay, we have had a run on all 15 boards, and now let's have a break for half an hour, and I'll see you after half an hour, please.
Yes, sir, start.
Start karo. Okay, welcome back to the sixth round of second Indore International Grandmaster Chess Tournament 2024 being played at the IPS Academy here. Tournament has a participation of 131 participants from various countries. 16 countries are participating. We have 4 continents participating in this. Nobody from Australia, but otherwise we have a large team of Asian countries. We have a player from South America, that's Peru. We have a player from USA, and we have a lot of Russians, Belarusians, a few players from Western Europe, Belgium, and a lot of players from Egypt, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and many other African countries. And we have a lot of almost all Asian countries participating. We have even South Korea. South Korea has not made an appearance in regular chess tournaments, but for the first time when they participated in the Asian Games previous year rather, it's next year, now we are in. So after that, they started taking part in the regular tournaments, and we see South Korean players are also here. Vietnam, of course, has good players, strong players, including one Grandmaster, and Belarusian. So Iran has sent a strong team. Egypt, Grandmaster from Egypt is there. A very strong tournament, and the top seed is Inyan, second seed is from Russia. So let's go to the top board where Grandmaster Fedorov is playing against Grandmaster Hesham. Hesham is from Egypt and Fedorov is from Belarus. So a standard position, I think we had left it here at this stage. White played b4 and black was taking some time. We have a closed Italian game where black is trying to attack on the king side. Irregular type of position, but yes, this idea is not uncommon. And white wants to counter with advance of the b pawn. He wants to play b pawn, and black has to try to attack the king. Black has made some risky moves, but black is ready for a king side attack and opening of the position after rook g8 and h5, perhaps b5, driving away the knight. The knight goes to a5, bishop goes back. So the relief for white is that one black piece will be stranded at e5 and will not be participating in the attack on the king side, so which could weaken the strength of the attack, which means white will have to start the plan. So black plays knight h5, white opens up the center, knight f4, a standard square. Capturing on f4 could lead to very dangerous initiative after g into f4. Now we see the purpose of move king h8. Black is going to play rook g8 and start attack, pawn into a6, pawn into a6. So knight on a5 is a bad piece. Had the knight been on the king side, white would have been in a bad position. But now position should be roughly equal, though I prefer black in this position, but white's position is quite solid and it's not easy. Knight goes back from h5 to f4 and f4 to g6. So nice way of regrouping the pieces. So e5 has been well guarded now, but what next? So g4, h3, this move encourages g4 and a bit surprising. I think white has a normal course of say knight c4 exchanging the knight, but then white can't claim any advantage, and the different course to play queen c2 and try to win the a5 knight, but attacking the queen is very lengthy. Queen c2, d5 and c4, then queen c3 would lead to sort of putting the a2 bishop in a very bad position, and the knight is not trapped anyway because knight would go back to b7. So the knight on a5, let it remain there, is not a bad piece, and knight c4 could have been a logical way. White plays h3, okay, g4, pawn takes pawn, bishop into pawn. It's extremely dangerous. The queen must move now, otherwise the d4 pawn is under attack. Knight f1, okay. Well, black is probably ready to open up against the f3 knight, but f5 could run into pawn followed by a capture on e5. So queen f6, getting out of the potential threat. Queen d2, getting out of the pin with a tactical way. The logical move knight h2 would run into h5 or bishop h5. So queen d2. for bishop into f3, he wants to play queen into h6 check. So perhaps the king was better on h7 after all, and not h8, knight h2. And now if you see the difference, because of queen d2, it's not possible to play h5, knight g5 check is really awkward to meet. And bishop into f3, knight into f3, guarding the d4 point. So the best attacking piece of black is gone. The potential, the piece which was creating potential danger against the g2 point is gone. And now it's time for black to bring back the knight. Direct knight c6 could be met with bishop d5, winning an exchange. So rook a b8 suggests itself, and then bringing back the knight. The moment black moves the knight, black moves the rook from a8, queen d3 would win the a6 pawn. So if black doesn't attack successfully, it's going to be tough. Black's plan is clear. Black is not going to bring back the a knight and move a. Black is attacking without the a5 knight and a8 rook, but black's plan is clear now. Perhaps h5, allowing knight g5, or just knight f4 when possible. One has to see the consequences of d into e5. And knight f4 followed by h5 becomes the plan, or direct h5 with the knight g5 check and knight into f7 check. So black has to prepare for the attack, and it doesn't seem to be very easy to attack. But in case of vague threats, it's not easy to guard. Where to put the king? King on f1 could be good, but again, white doesn't have any concrete plan. Bishop d5 was a possibility to provoke c6 and come back. Rook a b1 looks like a fine move. Rook a b1 intends bishop d5 followed by c4. There are various options. I think bishop d5 is a possibility. I don't see a threat by black at the moment. h5 is not a threat because of knight g5 check. Knight g5 check, king g7, and knight into f7, h4. It's a very wild game, and h5 maybe perhaps queen g5 as well. But queen g7, queen into h5 check. So h5, queen g5 is strong, but it's difficult to judge the position now because white d4 pawn also would be hanging, and white has adequately guarded d4, but any time a piece moves is going to be in trouble. Black's logical plan could also be to play rook g7 and rook g8, but then white should never allow black should never allow knight g5 check. So rook g7, rook g8 and knight f4 looks like a plan as well. And yes, white has no problems. Fundamentally, white is not in an inferior position, but to guard against king is always more difficult than guarding other pieces. Let's move to the second board now. At the end of 5 rounds, we had 5 players leading with 4.5 points and 8 players following them with 4 points. So the top boards are all 4.5 and 4 pointers. This is 2 players with 4.5 points. Next board we have Taibaz Arsh of Iran playing against Indian Grandmaster Deepan Chakravarti. The game has been a very simple, solid way, reverse Sicilian, and Deepan seems to have comfortably equalized. And let's look at the position where we were contemplating on black's move. I thought black was ready for knight d4 in a move or 2, or even directly, and even knight f5 followed by knight d4. So rook c1, knight d4 straight. I think that's the move we expected at that time. And rook e1 and bishop e6. So threat of bishop b3, black has comfortably equalized, rook b1 back and c6. So the g2 bishop has been blunted by the pawn c6 and b7. So white has no strategic advantage. So white wants to play a4 and b5. Logical move, knight into f3 check, bishop into f3. This bishop could become strong. So black takes steps to eliminate the bishop. Let's see how. Knight into d5. If b5, then knight into c3 followed by bishop d5. So knight into d5, bishop into d5. The bishops are getting exchanged now. Queen into d5, queen b3 threatening queen exchange. White would have slight advantage in the ending. So black goes queen d6, and now queen c2, and black comes back queen d5. So black is keeping the pieces active, and the ending after queen c5 may not be a very useful ending. So the players agreed to a draw. This position is roughly equal and neither side has any play. So both of them go to 5 points, and let's see who is able to win on 4.5 and reach the top tables. That means reaching 5.5 points. Let's go to board 3 now. Board 1, there is a chance for both players to reach 5.5. Let's come to board 3 where Savchenko is playing against Vianney Degunov, Karnataka, and we had left it at this stage. Knight a3, we believed that knight a3 followed by bishop f4 could give some advantage to white, and I think the game has gone the same way. e5 and bishop moves to e3. White is now ready to play rook c1 and knight b5. And direct knight b5 looks possible as well. Rook ad8, so c5 directly. Yes, also a strong option because knight is driven back, and knight b5 and knight d6 is a possibility. Rook a7 is a possibility. Knight b5, yes. Queen b8 and knight d6 could be a irritating possibility. Rook a7 is a logical move as well. Knight c3. White wants to take one of the bishops. When black didn't play bishop into b5, white wants to, nice maneuvering, I think loss of 2 moves, but he wants to put the knight on d5 instead of d6, and because d6 it would get exchanged with a knight. He wants to get a bishop for a knight. In such open positions with uneven pawn structure, a bishop is much stronger than a knight, and that could be a consideration. Bishop c6 looks like a move. Here bishop c6, knight d5 and bishop into d5. So white has 2 bishops and the black has weak pawn on b7. Queen b5 is a plan, so black rushes to move the knight to c6. So both the players have improved their position. Now black wants to put knight d4, after which black would have a very slight disadvantage. White plays queen f3. So knight d4 has 2 problems. Knight d4, in fact, white has a dangerous threat not only of bishop into c6 winning a pawn, but a stronger threat of queen f5. Queen f5 would threaten a mate against h7, and if black played g6, black would lose the f6 bishop. So yes, it seems that black has to find the most accurate move here. Otherwise, queen f5 or bishop into c6. Queen c8 stopping queen f5, and black is ready for knight d4. I think rook a7. After rook a7, white maintains some edge. a3 and bishop e7. Black is trying to play f5. So, well, a draw is agreed here. I thought it's possible to prevent f5 because rook into d8 and rook into d8 and rook d1. But I think it's possible for white to try for a win rather than making a draw here. But okay, perhaps the players know it better. So a draw was agreed to. At this stage, everybody begins with a very sharp intentions at the beginning of the game, but as the time reduces and players are worried about their position, they are willing to make compromising decisions. So a draw. So again, they go to 5 points. Now here we have theoretician Igor Glek, Russian, who is now playing for Belgium, and we have the top seed here, Grandmaster Inyan from Tamil Nadu, and knight a4. As we are discussing this position here, and knight a4 in spirit of this opening, and as world champion Tal would play b3, bishop b2, and then the c5 break. It's a standard plan. Russians are quite good at that, and it's not going to be easy. A direct c5. I thought it was okay. Since the e5 pawn has been weakened, it's possible to play direct c5. But I don't know if it's well guarded. But at the moment, it's a sacrifice. But d into c5 can be played, and rather d into c5 has to be played. But it was also possible to play b3 and then bishop a3 or bishop b2 and then c5. Pawn into pawn, b3. So slower plan, and bishop a3, he wants to gain back the pawn, so c4, and bishop into e7, queen into e7, knight b2. Preferring to give up a pawn rather than getting a bad pawn structure, the white knight is going to go to c4. But I'm sure that after winning the a6 pawn, white is still only slightly better. Bishop into f3, a good move. And queen b7, both pawns guarded, and for knight c4, rook a5. Same could be done with knight c4, but he played rook a5. The difference being knight c4 castle, knight into e5, rook e8, and the e4 pawn is lost. Whereas rook a5 attacks the pawn, wants to take castle, and rook into, oh, now knight c4, rook into e5 was possible. knight c4, rook d4 attacking the pawn, rook into e5. Now black is probably going to get rook b8, but then comes knight a5. If white is able to move the e5 rook and advance e4 e5, black is going to have a difficult time. So it's black must keep the attack on e4 point and hope for the best. Queen c3, the rook is attacked, e4 pawn lost back, but queen a5. So okay, now it's simplified. After queen into queen, rook into queen, white gets back the pawn, and white gets probably nothing more than the pawn. So game should end in a draw here. So we are looking at a position which hardly an advantage. It's possible to play a move guarding the a6 pawn, but it's an artificial move. Queen a7, queen b7 is also possible. Knight d6, then rook into e5. But yeah, queen b7 looks quite a possible option if black doesn't want to, or if black doesn't want to give up the extra pawn. So black is thinking queen b7, and white's strategic play was thematic but prematurely played c4, c5. One should never make a c5 break and leave the pawn, enemy pawn, extra enemy pawn there, because black has a chance of playing c5, c4 and weakening white's pawn. A logical plan would have b3, bishop b2 and then c5, and black can't take d into c5 because knight into e5 would hang. And the bishop, black is now ready to play c4. So as long as black has extra pawn, black doesn't matter. Direct c4 fails to knight b6 here. So rook d8, intending c4, and now c4. So I think just a couple of moves calculation has enabled black to get a easy equality. Black cannot lose this position. Let's move the board 5 quickly. We had left it at the opening when white seemed to have a very dominating position, and bishop into bishop, bishop into knight, and queen into bishop. So the e6 point is very sensitive, and anytime the g6 break, knight on e5, black is ready with powerful options. Knight e5, I think black is in a bad way. If black takes queen into g5, something like f4 could be very awkward to meet, or even sacrifice. So queen h4, trying to drive away the bishop, which is really powerfully placed. I believe that g6 gambit may not work here, taking the bishop, and then gf7 not. But queen f1 looks like a positional move, and black probably will play knight to d5. But I think the black has not solved the problem. Bishop b4, giving the bishop and taking the knight, interesting option. And queen into h3 looks completely forced, and after bishop into c5, g6 needs to be played. Now if black can maintain that and prevent white from playing g6 break, then black is fine. So perhaps too committal move, giving up this h3 bishop, which is the main piece in attack. So what could be the reason for that? Is the black queen in trouble? I can't see. Queen would go to f5, where it can't be attacked by any piece. So black seems to be okay here now, and queen h3 looks like the logical move, and the last has less time. But I think most of the problems are solved except the b7 pawn. So bishop into queen h3, bishop into c5 may threaten queen b4. Not really. I think black is fine here. We have a game between Aswath and Sham Nikhil, Benko Gambit, the sharp variation. We had left at this stage, queen h3. We're analyzing this move, threatening knight g4. White must play knight f4. The queen goes back, and then white plays bishop to d2. It's possible to play bishop to b2 as well to oppose the bishop. And now the problem is, if black doesn't have a recourse of c4 break, then white would have just got a winning position with a4. Unfortunately, a4 is always met with c4, and that's the reason why the control of c4 square is crucial, and knight on f4 is not really well placed for that. The strategic plan could be king g2, e4, knight d3, knight b2 and knight c4, but too slow surely. If white is able to do that, white would be better, but meanwhile too many weaknesses, and the bishop better move to e1, I think, guarding a4 straight. So okay, he has analyzed something for c4, and so c4 has not been played, which means there was some problem with c4. And what could that be? Pawn into pawn, and taking on a4, knight b5 or something. Yes, perhaps c4 is not very accurate here. So knight g4, black wants to put knight on e5 first, bishop e1, knight e5, now ready to put c4, knight b5, and c4 looks like a logical move here, but for c4, can white play a5? Knight b5 has come, so now the a4 pawn is no longer a target because white can push the pawn a5 when the knight is not hanging on b5. So knight a3 can be a plan, followed by a5. Let's see, c4 directly as expected, and I'm not very comfortable with white's position. White's pawns are falling apart. a4 will go and the b3 will get exchanged with c4. Yes, the material will be equal, but the weakness is quite serious. It's possible to play for equality, perhaps with bishop c3 and take on a4, the knight d3, exchange a few pieces and have draw for. Yeah, I think it looks like a logical course, but every time the knight moves from f4, there could be queen h3 coming. Bishop c3 looks fine here. And pawn into pawn, queen into pawn, knight into a4, bishop a1, knight c5. Yeah, it's black has initiative for sure, and white could blunder a piece or something in this position. Tough position. Objectively, black has all the chances, although white is a pawn up, and perhaps the competitors can equalize, but difficult for human being. White has some assets as well, knight d4 and knight c6 if it counts, but c6 has been covered. Light color bishop exchange, so the bg2 is not there. So no real plan of feasibility of any specific plan. And we move to board 7, Ilam Parthi, former world under 10 champion, world under 14 champion, plays strange opening, and white black plays rook a7. The Vietnamese player plays rook a7, which I can't understand, and rook d7, yes, but one has to be prepared for against the kingside attack. And now white wants to lift the c3 knight and then the g5, e5 rook, and this is going to be quite tough to guard this. Of course, black has kept the option of sacrificing rook into d3. So if something drastically goes wrong, black could give up an exchange. But at the moment, it looks very risky. Rook e3, g3, there is a natural plan now. Yes, rook a3 played, queen c7. Rook g3 looks good. Yes, h6 attacked. And oh, a trap. Can you find out what happens to queen into h6? Can white play queen into h6 or no? So queen into h6 is not a good move because of queen into g3. Black gives a queen for a rook and gets the queen for a pawn. For queen into h6, black can't play g into h6 because the pawn is pinned against the king, but black removes the pinning piece with queen into g3. Black gives a queen for a rook, and when white takes the queen for a rook, black takes the queen, pawn into queen, which means white has lost a rook for a pawn. Yet the position is dangerous. Sometimes the sacrifice rook into e6 also can be considered here. I think it's an extremely difficult position to play. Rook into e6, pawn into e6, queen into e6, check. King must go to h8. Rook into e6, he has rook into d3, and rook into e7, rook into g3, rook into c7, and rook into h3, rook into c7. It's a complex game, but black has to see what happens in rook into e6 and rook e3. So rook into e6 are not good. Now the threat is queen into h6, and if queen into g3, then rook into g3. So king starts running, and white needs to now lift the knight. If white is able to make use of the knight properly, then black would be in difficulty. Knight e4 is possible, but then black would take with the bishop and not with knight. So a difficult position, and the clock has stopped, which means that we aren't at the actual position. So suddenly we have 1 minute left for fight, okay? And now we had 32 minutes and rook e3 was a tough move, yes, sometimes. Oh no, 32 minutes. I think there's something wrong with the clock. 47 minutes and 34 minutes. So normal fight, king f8 and knight e2, the logical square. Rook d5 to create a possibility of rook h5 trapping the queen. So, and suddenly we see 1 minute. Yes, rook d5, strong one, 32 minutes taken. Is white losing some material? But the queen has no good square. Queen h4 would run into some combination. But yes, well, rook h5 is a concrete threat. Something has to be done about it. And that something is not rook into g7 for sure. But yes, rook into g7. Threatening, yeah, rook into g7, king into g7, rook g3 check, queen into h6 check. Yeah, so we have a very complicated position coming. Rook into g7, king into g7, rook g3 check, rook g5. So no real attack. And bishop h7 doesn't make any sense as well. To capture bishop into f6 is counterproductive because there is no hope of any attack. And then black is likely to be better. So lifting the knight turned out to be a mistake. Maybe knight was better on e4 and then bishop into e4 was possible, then perhaps rook into e4. So complex position, king f8, right move, and white's rooks are perhaps looking like paperweights, doing nothing but stopping the own pawns from creating a square. So knight e2 and rook d5, 0.00. I think we'll have to go to the next game because we're not probably able to get the exact score. When the clock is not correct, it means so. So here we have international master from Sri Lanka, under 18 Asian champion, who just won the Asian under 18 championship a couple of 3 weeks before, playing white side, and Kartavya Anarkat, who was in a who played the opening very fast. So, and apparently black has fallen in some opening trap, but now the position seems to be all right. Bishop d2, and black has castled after all this time. Black has a lot of activity of pieces, but nothing has been lost. Rook f2 looks like a safer move here, and queen into d7 perhaps is possible, but quite risky. Rook f2, a simple move played, and queen e6 guarding the pawn. Bishop c3, exchanging rooks. White wants to play it safe. King into f2. I would have preferred queen into f2 followed by rook d1, rook d6, but rook a8, rook d1, bishop c6. I think queen should move to h4 and rook to d6, and then e6 on the queen b6. So black squares. I think there's a lot of freedom for white forces. So if a5 is taken, then the e5 pawn is lost. If rook d6 is played, then queen comes to c4, and if white gets e6, black gets b4. It's going to be a wild game, and white had lost the control of the game long back in the opening. That's the reason why white is a pawn down for a long time, and the strategic weakness at d6 doesn't make any sense. There are no pieces landing there. Black is ready for b4, after which white will be crushed. Bishop into a5, queen into e5. The attack already starts. The h2 pawn is under attack, and c3, b2 pawn is attacked. A difficult position for white with only 2 minutes to go. We can see a major upset by Kartavya Anarkat, who is very good in opening part of the game. Let's move to board 9 now. Ratnakaran, one of the strong attacking masters, playing against Ritwis Parab. I think Ritwis had played quite a awkward opening, and b4 was played. Here I was seriously thinking bishop f3 and rook f1 played an important role, but b4 threatening b5. So black exchanges the bishops. The problem is solved, but the king remains in center and will not be able to castle. Bishop c5, and black must play rook into c5 here and knight e6 and try to castle, but no compensation. Queen d7, and if queen moves to e2, what does he do? Queen e2 or queen f2 and queen f6. Quite a strong move, I think. Queen f2, queen e2. Let's see who's the strongest. Queen f2, threatening rook into queen and threatening queen into f6, queen f6. So there comes queen c6, which means rook d6 followed by rook d6, queen into e4. And how about attacking the f7 now? Then rook goes to h7. Rook f1, f7 attacked. Rook h7, and I think now it's going to be a checkmate probably. Bishop into knight and queen f6. So direct queen f6, yeah, but then queen into queen. So let's look at rook d5, rook d6, so different moves. Bishop into f8 looks very strong as well. Rook d6, queen into e4. No attack against c2 anyway, and probably a penetration at d8 could be fatal. Rook f d2, rook f d1 would threaten rook d8 check, and if knight e6, then rook into e6 check, which means the game will be over. Perhaps in this position, it is also possible to play direct rook d6 and queen into bishop rook to d1. So a bad game for Ritviz, a very one-sided, great attacking piece by Ratnakaran. We go to Prakhar Bajaj versus Audi, and Audi is a strong player from Goa, and we had left at this stage black white played h4 trying to trap the knight, and rook d7 and d5. So Prakhar plays aggressively. Bishop e3. The d5 pawn is not in danger. Bishop b6 is awkward to meet, and sometimes there could be threats of h5 as well. Black has some problems with the weakness. Taking with the pawn, which means that there is a possibility of e5 coming sometime and the bishop getting opened up. A very risky decision to take with the pawn. White is already threatening e5. So black plays e5. And now bishop a2 is one option, rook d1, bishop e7, bishop b6. So complex decision, rook c6 or rook c8. Rook c6 is possible as well. Now where does the bishop go then? Bishop b6, knight f4 is an additional option which can sometime eventually run into knight into e5, but knight f4, queen g4. I think moving the bishop from this square deserves some special discussion. Knight f4 is a possibility, followed by queen g4, and suddenly we have a different type of tactical possibilities coming. Knight f4 really looks good. If knight into e5, you just have d into e5. So knight f4, queen moves, and queen g4 to come. Queen f1. Queen f1 will be forced for knight f4, and then black moves the rook. Then knight into e5 could hang. So knight f4 fails to perhaps to queen f1. There are some tactical possibilities coming with queen g4, but then it has to be analyzed in depth, and whether it's good enough for an attack which sacrifices. Very sharp position. Let's move to board 11th. Saurav Anand, former national under-9 champion and under-19 champion from Bihar, Patna, playing opening. Not a very great opening he had. A pawn was lost as we were discussing this possibility. Black did not have very particularly good, white does not have particularly good pawn structure. But rook e8 is a possibility. Taking on f2 looks risky because of rook g2, but yes, it's still possible to click bishop into f2, rook g5, g6, rook e7. So complicated position, but unsuccessful attack by white, and if at all anyone can win, it's only black. I was wondering if even a normal bishop move was fine as well, bishop f6 or something, giving away the e6 pawn, and the opponent would have a lot of weaknesses. Knight f4 directly was also a possibility, but bishop h4, d into e6, f into c. Here to knight f4 was a possibility if the g7 was guarded. All along the g7 needs to be guarded, so purpose of bishop f6 is that you could move knight f4 quickly. Bishop h4, so knight is not going to be utilized in the game. D into e6, f into e6, rook into e6. But a strong bishop for white, and no reason for not exchanging this bishop. Rook into f2 possible, rook g4 and bishop f6, knight e4. So either it can be a black win or a draw, but surely white has no chances. Again 0.00, which means they have lost the track of the board. We have Nitin Babu versus Sahil Day. We left at this position where white was left playing for a draw, and as we were discussing, the exchanging the piece would lead to a draw, because generally the positions with queen and rook endings, they have quite simplified nature, and the draw is likely. Whether to guard the b2 pawn or to safeguard the king side, I think committal decision taken, queen c3. Surely he has analyzed the consequences of queen into f3 well, because queen into f3 is very close to now strong attack. So rook e1, he doesn't allow the rooks to come and give a check. Queen g4 check, runs away king f1, h5. Black wants to play h4, h3, and queen g2 met. Giving the f3 pawn was a very committal decision, and rook e8, rook e1 looks like a possibility, and queen h3 check, then king g1. But yes, I think white has permitted dangerous attack, and taking on c5, for example, would be very dangerous. h4, rook e3, h3, rook double, yes, queen into c5, even rook e8 and rook into c2. So it's not advisable to play with a weak king. Black has chances, but just because it's a queen and rook ending, drawing chances also are there. And then we come to the next three games which are still going on. Zuve Amarat, a regular visitor to India, who has played several tournaments, and black has given up the queen. Okay, Matta Vinay Kumar has good imaginative power, and here white plays queen f3, threatening knight f6 check. So rook a7 supporting the queen, and now comes pawn into pawn, and comes rook c7. A checkmate on f7, and queen attacked, so queen into. So queen lost for rook and piece, but okay, not a big disadvantage. Rook, bishop and pawn are generally equal to queen, so here we have equal number of pawns, which means that if just a pawn down, of course white could create a passed pawn on the queen side, and the opportunity was there on the previous move, but now it's lost. So white first wants to safeguard. Next step could be to exchange rooks, and e3. Okay, so white wants to activate the rooks. White has excellent winning chances here, probably a forced win, but black is not without chances of a fortress. We move to the next game. National junior champion Mritika Malik is playing against Kashish Jain, and we had left it this stage. We were wondering what's the strong move here, and bishop a2. We're also contemplating direct knight g5 here. So bishop a2, bishop f8, and bishop g5. A irritating move. Bishop e7 is a possibility though. Bishop e7, bishop d2, and strange that black is not happy with bishop f8. Queen f8, bishop b3. Black is worse, but black is playing ambitiously. Knight g5, okay. And knight is going to come to h5 as well. White hasn't played bishop c3 at all. Bishop c3 was a possibility all along, but then it wouldn't have given knight g5. So interesting game. White has excellent chances. Clock shows 0.00, so we have lost the track of the game probably. Let's move to the last board available to us on the DG board. PV Nandita, woman grandmaster, playing against S. Dhananjay of Raipur, and the nice move was played by Dhananjay d4, which activates the knight. So objectively black has a very strong pawn structure. Knight on c5 prevents the white pawns, black is as good as a pawn up on the king side. If black can roll the king side pawns, white could be in trouble. Let's see how Nandita plays. She wants to create some threats. F5. If black can get E5 next to this, black would be really in a good position. So bishop E2, knight F6, rook E3. E5 has been prevented. F5 a risky move. If black gets E5, black will be much better, but getting E5 is now becoming difficult. White is going to double rooks. F4. Again, very sharp and tactical type of moves Dhananjay is good at. Rook E5 is a logical move, but it could lose some material. There's a chance of losing some material. Rook E5, bishop E8, knight F3 looks like a standard move here. Queen B4. A nice move, keeping something pinned and threatening to take on E6. So runs away, rook attacked, and knight F3 looks like a logical move. Attacking E6, black would probably guard the pawn. So we have a position where now black has too many weaknesses because black did not advance the pawn in a systematic manner. The E pawn should have been in front of the F pawn, supported by the F pawn, because E pawn is in the open file, and yet there are threats because of knight coming to D3 at times. So although most of the time knight D3 is not coming because of knight into E6 and queen into F8 check and knight into E6. So white has a advantage, saving the rook, knight F3, and I don't see a way to trap the rook, because knight D7, the rook gets some square on, the rook has a square on G5, but still awkward position, and the game is going to be decided by a tactical oversight rather than a strategic conclusion. So we have 15 games, and we have a lot of results here. We had one draw and one white win, and all the other games are being played. So we'll stop our broadcast telecast here, and tomorrow the game starts at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and we'll have a look at the 7th round games tomorrow around 2:15 or 2:30. So watch the next round tomorrow. Thank you.